and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Luke chapter 7. This is where we're going to be again today. In our experience as Christians, now I can only speak to it from my perspective. Maybe nobody in this room ever has this happen to them. That could be. I could be the only one. That's entirely possible. That we come to the place wherein we find ourselves looking at what it is we say we have believed, and we come to a place where we doubt. Now, again, I might be the only one that ever does that. That's okay. I'm willing to be that person. But I'm going to say for most of us, there's got to come a point at which when we're praying or when we go through something or we come to a spot where all of a sudden things don't look the way we say they ought to look or the way we think they ought to look, that all of a sudden a little bit of doubt creeps in. How many, don't raise your hand, how many of us have ever come to God and just to make sure we've said, God, I believe that Jesus died on the cross. I believe He rose from the grave. Save me. Forgive me of my sins and save me. No raising hands. I mean, it's a hard thing. The experience like James related to us in Sunday school, that experience of peace coming over us in that way. There are lots of days that go by where we might not experience that. And the circumstances of life start to cause us to doubt. I don't know how many of you in this room ever look at Facebook. Facebook is a lie. It is. I mean, what do you do when you open up Facebook? Everybody's happy, man. They're smiling like billy goats eating stickers. You know, everybody in there is just the biggest grin they can plant. Everything's going great. Look at my life, how great I am, how great it is for me. And we know that's not true. They're going through stuff just like everybody else. Doubt can do things to us. It can cause us to, first of all, feel the doubts. Then it can cause us to feel guilt about the doubts. And then it can cause us to feel like we're the only one with them, which is even worse. Let's look at this text. I'll begin reading in chapter 7 of Luke, verse 18. John's disciples told him about all these things, and calling two of them, John sent them to Jesus to ask, "Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect somebody else?" Well, when the people came to Jesus, they said, "John the Baptist sent us to you and said, 'Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect another?'" At that very time, Jesus cured many people who had diseases and evil spirits. He gave sight to those who were blind. So he replied to John's messengers, saying, "Go back and report to John what you've seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news of the gospel is preached to the poor. Blessed is the one who does not fall away on account of me," Jesus said to them. After John's messengers left, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John the Baptist. "What did you go out in the desert to see? A reed swaying in the wind? If not, what did you find there? You found a man dressed in fine clothes? No. Those who wear expensive clothes and indulge in luxury are in palaces. What did you find? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it was written in the texts. I will send a messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you. And I tell you, of those born among women, there is no one greater than John. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than John." John the Baptist, what's going on here? John the Baptist is in prison. Now, you can go back to Matthew 14. You can read a little bit more about this than Luke records. But we really don't know so much about John's imprisonment except by, and I love this, by the secular history. Josephus records this in his Chronicles of the Jewish Nation. He records the imprisonment of John the Baptist, where he was placed, and why he was there. Now, Matthew 14 tells us why. This is the time of Rex Lex. Herod Antipas has divorced his wife and has married his brother's wife. He seduced his brother's wife and married her. And John, as a good Jewish prophet, spoke ill of that, because for the Jews this was just a terrible scandal. Josephus goes into great detail about how the Jews felt about this. The Bible does not. But we've got that Jewish record. And there's a funny thing that Mark Twain said about anybody who is a good example. And John was a good example. He said, one of the hardest things to put up with is the annoyance of a good example. Isn't that true? Get around somebody, you know, the whole picture of the misery loves company, and if we're all going to go a-sinning, we want to bring plenty of people with us so we can feel better about what we're doing. And if there's one person in that crowd that's a good example, they're a pain in the rear end to them. Who wants that? Well, John had spoken truth to power. And this is Rex Lex, the king is law. So, Herod had thrown him into prison. Now, you got to realize for John the Baptist, this is incredibly cruel. We know of John the Baptist that he didn't even have a home. He lived in the desert. He ate locusts and wild honey. I've never eaten a grasshopper myself. I guess if you put enough honey on the grasshopper, they taste okay. I don't know. But that's what John lived off of. He was dressed in animal skins. He was a wild man. And the only restrictions John had were the horizon and the dirt. That was it. He lived out of doors. Now imagine where they've put John. They've put him in what's known as the Castle Macherus. This is a big fortress that's built up on a high cliff on the northeastern side of the Dead Sea, east of the Jordan. It's still there today. The ruins are. And this place was built there prior to Herod, even Herod the Great. Herod the Great, it was torn down by Pompey in the 50s BC. Herod the Great came and rebuilt the thing. Well, about 1,700 people lived in this place. It was so big. But it was built as a buffer because the only thing on the eastern side of it is the desert. So people who wanted to attack Israel could come across the desert, and this fort stood in their way, because the best crossing across the Jordan is right down beneath the fort. And from the Jordan side of it, you couldn't even get there. It's just a sheer cliff. So it's a good fort. But this guy, like most castles, there's a dungeon. It's underground. If you were put in prison in the Roman Empire at that time in history, chances are you were going to die just from being in prison. It's very unlikely that if you were thrown in prison, the Romans didn't care. They would feed you and stuff, but you have to realize when you're put in a Roman prison, you don't walk around behind bars. They chain you to the wall. You can stand up sometimes, depends on how you're chained, but everything your body does in that spot where you are. And there are other people chained in there too. And it's in the dark, and there's no ventilation, so you can imagine the conditions these people are in. It's just horrific. That's where John the Baptist was. This wild man who lived out of doors is stuck in this hole. No light, no windows, no air. For 2 years, Josephus says, he was stuck there. Because he had said, Herod Antipas, you should not have taken your brother Philip's wife. That's wrong. Herod wanted to put him to death, but Herod Antipas was afraid because he knew the people viewed John as a prophet. Herod's a good politician. I don't want to kill John because if I do, the people will be mad at me. Well, what happens? And you know, by the way, speaking of that being incarcerated where he was, that fort became extremely important later in history in the Jewish nation. In 66 AD, you know, there was a rebellion in Palestine. The Jews rebelled against the Romans. Because somebody had sacrificed some animal that was unclean on the temple steps, really made them mad. They rebelled. They took up arms against the Romans. They sealed themselves within the walls of Jerusalem. They also sealed themselves within Macherus Castle Macherus. And the Romans, they'd take a dim view of anything like a rebellion, so they built a siege wall around the castle. There was this point at which, as long as you stayed in the castle, you're probably going to be all right. But this young kid, he was in his teens, named Eleazar, Josephus tells us all this, went out stupidly and got caught by the Romans. Well, on that giant wall they had built around the castle, they took him up there and they flogged him. Now, when you were flogged by the Romans, you might die from that. It was such a terrible thing to be scourged. They got done flogging him, and then they started to build a cross. They were going to crucify him in full view of everybody inside the castle. All the Jews who had sealed themselves in the castle, that was too much. They surrendered because they just couldn't bear to see this young boy crucified up on that burn. But then the Romans said, just to teach you a lesson, we're going to come into the fort, and they did, and they killed 1,700 people that were inside the fort. They let the rest of the zealots all got let go home, but the people who were living in the fort were put to death, Josephus records. So John is 2 years in this hole. There's a castle in England called the Carlisle Castle. It's still there too. And during the time when Scotland was rebelling from England, they would put the Highlanders in this castle dungeon, in prison. And in the prison, there's one little slit of a window about 7 feet off the ground. And there are marks underneath it where all the handprints of the Highlanders who'd been put in there would pull themselves up just so they could look out, just for a little bit, to see the outside. This is so cruel for John to be put there. Well, let me ask us all a question. Here's John the Baptist. I'm a called prophet of God. He was called when he was in Elizabeth's body as a growing embryo. God called him. Remember, Mary comes to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth says, I felt the baby leap in my womb. So John was called from infancy to be a prophet. Both Elizabeth and Zacharias knew this. And he served God his whole life as a prophet. And now, what's the reward for that? He's been shoved into Macherus Castle dungeon for 2 years. Now, I just want to ask all of us in this room. You know, if I'm at work and I had trouble with my truck a few weeks back, it cost me a lot of money. That was persecution enough for me to think, God, do you not care about the fact that my truck will not run the way it ought? That's the shallowness of my ability to deal with persecution or punishment. Look, God, I'm called to do this work for you. How come you're not taking good care of me? I mean, that's how shallow I am. Well, 2 years, John's in this hole. He has spent his whole life serving God. Do you think for 1 second that John doesn't doubt? That's the whole context of this. John sends people out to ask Jesus, are you the one? In other words, have I wasted my life? Was I wrong about everything you've given me to do, God? See, John's an Old Testament prophet. You have to realize how the prophets thought as they looked ahead to Messiah, Jesus, the Savior. The Jews didn't look to Jesus like you and me. They were looking for somebody to come in, smite the Romans, get rid of them, put somebody in the lineage of David back on the throne in Jerusalem, and then Jerusalem would become the navel of the world once again. That's what they were waiting for. That's the way the prophecies were understood. That's the way John understands it. So when Jesus doesn't do those things, John says, was I wrong? Did I believe the wrong thing? I'm stuck here in this prison. So he sends messengers to find out if Jesus is the right one. He wanted some kind of confirmation. Jesus then tells him what he's doing and sends that word back to John. I bet you John was still scratching his head a little bit when he got that word back, because it doesn't fit what John's looking for. He's looking for the great smiter of Rome. Smite the Romans. Get rid of them. Put us back where we're supposed to be. We're God's chosen. And that's not the way it worked out. John wasn't Jesus says a reed shaken by the wind. Do you know what that means? It's like saying common. Because in that part of the world, there are little scrubby reeds standing everywhere, and every time the wind blows, they move. So what Jesus is saying to the crowd, were you looking for something common in John? But what did you find? You found something very uncommon. You didn't find a reed shaking in the wind. You found a mighty oak who was willing to speak truth to power. That's why John's in the prison, because he spoke truth to power. I don't know how many of you have ever read Fox's Book of Martyrs. Has anybody in here ever read that? I have. It's pretty dark. It's a dark book, and what it does is it records people all the way from the time of Polycarp in the early parts of the 2nd century all the way forward through the Reformation, people who were put to death because they were followers of Jesus. And he tells the story of this one guy named Thomas Bilney, who was in England. And this is prior to the Reformation. And Thomas Bilney was preaching to his congregation salvation by Jesus alone through faith, and that the icons, the Roman Catholic statues, Mary and John and Saint whoever, they don't mean anything. Well, the officials from the Catholic Church came and heard one of his sermons. And they sent some emissaries to Thomas Bilney and said, Thomas, we need you to come and have a little conference with us. So they took him in, and they said, if you don't stop preaching this, we're going to have you burned alive. Thomas thought, you know, maybe I need to rethink all this. I think I'll go back and I'll conform to what it is you've asked me to conform to. The burning alive part, the rope and the wood that you showed me when I came into the meeting here today doesn't look good to me. I think I'll just go back to preaching about the icons. He did that for a few weeks, and then he felt convicted by God and said, I can't do this. And they came back and they caught him and they burned him alive because he was preaching the truth to power, you see, just like John the Baptist. And I just have to say, I don't thank the Lord we're not in that place now today. But I have to say, those are the times when God's really going to show up. He's really going to show up. Now, what about our doubts? Do you think for a minute do we really believe that God didn't know that John the Baptist had doubts? Are you the one who's supposed to come, or should we expect another? That's doubt. He's wondering, have I believed wrongly? Have I invested my whole life just to wind up here in this prison for the wrong thing? What about our doubts? Are they sinful? Does God look dimly on us when we doubt? I mean, there are some scriptures that seem to indicate that to some degree. I want to just think about it this way. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. How many weddings have we been to in our lifetime where 1 Corinthians 13 wasn't preached? Even if everybody in the room's a pagan, they want to hear 1 Corinthians 13, the love passage spoken. Love's patient, love's kind, love's always long-suffering, all these nice things. But while you're getting married, of course, George Bernard Shaw said, the problem with marriage is this. He said, we take two people, we bring them to an altar, and we make them swear that they will remain in this hyper-excited, tiring, ridiculously overcome state of mind for the rest of their lives. Right? I mean, that's kind of what marriage is, which, as we know from experience, that's not the way it goes. That's not the way it goes. But the love passage says something to us very significant that I don't know if we've ever thought about really carefully. Paul says, faith, hope, and love. Of these three, love will remain. Why is that? Well, because once we're face to face with God, who needs faith? There He is. And if I'm face to face with God, that means everything I've hoped for, I have. The only thing that then remains is love. So, to me, when I think about doubt, I think doubt's the place where there's room for me. Right? That's where there's space for me to be a human being in front of God. And I guarantee you, just based upon that text, faith and hope are the soil of doubt. That's where doubts come from. I'm believing something I want to be true. I believe it. I'm hoping that I'll stand with God forever as a believer. And those are the two places where doubt springs up. I mean, after all, once I've got face to face with God, I'm not going to doubt at all, right? So John is in this prison and he's disappointed and he's doubting and he's trying to find out, Have I believed the right thing? There was a pilot who was making, early in the days of aviation, he'd make a long trip. And when you made long trips like Lindbergh, you made long trips in the early days of aviation, you were taking your life in your hands because aviation just was not. The engines were the problem for the most part. They just weren't that reliable. And so he gets up to his operational point at about 9,000 feet, and he hears this sound. It sounds like, he's thinking to himself, he's halfway in his flight, and he thinks, that sounds like a rat chewing on something. What's he chewing on? Is he chewing on the fuel line? That's bad. Is he chewing on a wire and there's going to be a spark and I'm going to go up in flames? Those are bad things. What can I do? I can't stop. This is long before autopilot. You've got to keep flying the thing or you're going to go down to the ground. So he says, what am I going to do? I'm out over the water. I hear this thing. He said, I know what I'll do. He climbed up to 20,000 feet and stayed there, which was the operational ceiling of the airplane, and the gnawing stopped. You know why? Not enough air up there for the rat to breathe. He killed it by climbing to 20,000 feet. That is such a picture of you and me and John. That the doubts are going to come, right? They're going to come. Anybody who says they never doubt, I want to meet them. I would love to meet that person and have a long conversation. But there's a place where we've got to come to a spot where we're so broken by doubt that we're willing to take those doubts and climb up and hand them to God and believe that it's okay for us to do so. Crises are going to come, things are going to happen. May not be John's. We may not be thrown in a prison because we're Christians. In this country, that's unlikely. But John's crisis really wasn't the prison. John's crisis was meaninglessness. Have I believed the wrong thing? And as followers of Jesus, we may come to places in our life where we say, you know what, God's not really helping me here. I know somebody like that right now. Found out Friday that they're in a place in their life where they say to the people, they say, you need to really come pray and ask God to help you with this. And their response is, what has God done for me? They're in a very broken place. But do we think that if we come to a place of doubt, that if we say, you know what, I'm going to talk to God about this, and the first thing we start by doing is we tell God how pretty the sunset is, and how beautiful the earth is, and how nice dolphins are, and how thankful we are for church, if we are thankful for that, how much we want to be part of God's kingdom, all this flowery language as though we're going to butter God up, and He's going to give us what we want more readily. That's just crazy. That is crazy. God knows if we doubt. He knows that already. So why not, just like you would take a person here on this earth who you really trusted with your heart, you would tell them how you really feel, and you'd feel all right about that. Why not do that with God? And allow God then to reach in. Look, honesty with God is the best thing you will ever learn to be. Honest with God is the best thing you will ever learn in your life. Take it from me. It's the best lesson I ever learned as a follower of Jesus, was that I can say anything to God and His shoulders are big enough to bear it. They're always, He doesn't go away. He's not shocked when we say, God, you know what? I'm doubting that you really care about me at all. That doesn't shock God. He already knows it anyway. Why not take the heartache to Him and see what He'll do with it? I bet you John did. I bet you John did. I don't know where everybody is, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to speak with me, you want to pray with me, talk to me after the service about your life or this church, I'll stay as long as it takes as we close.